A mother's fear. Marion's heart was heavy as she pulled into the driveway of their new home. The house was small, but it was theirs. New beginnings, a fresh start after years of struggle. Caleb, her son, sat quietly in the passenger seat of the car, his wheelchair locked into place, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His face, usually bright and curious, was now shadowed with a quiet sadness that Marion couldn't ignore. The weight of the silence in the car pressed down on her chest, and she fought to keep her anxiety at bay. "Caleb, sweetheart, how was school today?" Marion asked gently, her voice trying to sound light, as if it wasn't laden with concern. She glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch even a glimpse of the boy who had once been so full of energy and excitement. "It was okay," Caleb mumbled, not looking up from the window. "Just the same." The same. That was what Marion feared. She had hoped that moving to a new neighborhood, enrolling Caleb in a new school, would provide him with the opportunity he needed, a chance to make new friends, to escape the isolation that had plagued him for so long. But 3 weeks had passed, and Caleb was more withdrawn than ever. His once radiant smile was now a rare thing, and his laughter, which used to fill the house, was almost non-existent. Marion's heart clenched as she pulled the car into the garage. She helped Caleb out of the car and into the house, her hands trembling as she adjusted the wheelchair. As he wheeled himself to his room, Marion watched him, her chest aching. His shoulders were slumped, his head down, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his small frame. When Caleb was settled in his room, Marion sat on the couch in the living room, trying to distract herself with the mundane tasks of everyday life, folding laundry, wiping down counters, but her mind was consumed with thoughts of her son. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The old school had been difficult for Caleb. He had faced teasing, exclusion, and the constant reminder that he was different. But Marion had hoped that the fresh start would be a chance to leave all of that behind. She had hoped Caleb would finally find a place where he could belong. Later that evening, as Marion prepared dinner, her mind kept drifting back to Caleb's first day at the new school. He had been so nervous, more nervous than he'd let on. Marion had seen the way his hands shook as he tried to button his shirt, the hesitation in his voice as he told her goodbye at the school doors. But she had reassured him, told him everything would be fine, that this new chapter would be a chance for him to shine. But now, after 3 weeks, it seemed like the same old story. Caleb wasn't shining. He was dimming, retreating further into himself, and Marion couldn't understand why. She knew her son, knew how intelligent and kind he was. But what if the world, cruel as it sometimes was, couldn't see him for who he truly was? She thought back to the meeting with the school counselor, the one who had promised her that things would be different, that Caleb would be welcomed into the fold, that the staff would work together to ensure he was supported. But Marion had to admit there had been no real change, no real progress. Caleb had come home every day with the same quiet sadness, and Marion felt helpless. That night, as she sat on the edge of Caleb's bed, she reached for his hand. He was staring at the wall, lost in thought, his mind miles away. "Caleb," Marion began softly, "is something going on at school? Are the kids, are they still treating you the same way?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He chewed on his lip, as if the words were stuck in his throat. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was barely audible. "It's nothing, Mom. Really, they don't bother me. I just don't fit in, okay?" Marion's heart broke. She could hear the truth in his words, the deep sorrow that echoed beneath the surface. He wasn't saying it outright, but she knew what he meant. He didn't fit in because the other kids couldn't see past his wheelchair, couldn't see past the difference. They saw him as the kid in the chair, not as Caleb, the boy with dreams, with talents, with a heart full of kindness. Marion wanted to say something to make it better. She wanted to tell him that things would change, that this was just a phase, that everything would be okay. But she couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. Caleb needed to feel heard, to know that she understood his pain. He needed to know that she would do whatever it took to help him find his place in the world. The next day, as Marian stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, a decision began to form in her mind. She had tried everything she could think of. Talking to the school, encouraging Caleb to reach out to others. But nothing had worked. It was time to take matters into her own hands. She had been the one who had always fought for Caleb, advocating for him when no one else would. She wasn't about to stop now. The idea came to her in an instant. She would take matters into her own hands in a way she hadn't before. Marian had heard of parents using hidden cameras to uncover what was happening with their children in situations where the truth was difficult to uncover. What if she could use that same tactic to discover what was happening at school? What if there was something going on that Caleb wasn't telling her? What if he was being bullied, excluded, and didn't know how to tell her? It wasn't a decision Marian made lightly, but she knew that this was the only way to understand what Caleb was going through. She couldn't help him if she didn't know what was truly happening behind the scenes. Later that afternoon, after Caleb had gone to his room to study, Marian carefully set up a small camera in the back pocket of his backpack, hidden from view. It was discreet, a small device that could record audio and video, but it would give her the answers she desperately needed. She told herself it was for Caleb's own good. She had to know if there was something going on that he wasn't able to express. The next morning, Marian kissed Caleb goodbye as he headed out the door for school. He looked the same as he always did, quiet, withdrawn, but determined to make it through the day. She watched him until he disappeared down the street, and then, with a sigh, she returned inside, anxiously awaiting the moment when she would finally get the answers she so desperately needed. The school day passed slowly for Marian. She found herself unable to focus on anything, constantly checking the clock, waiting for the moment when she would be able to review the footage from Caleb's backpack. The anticipation was eating away at her, but she tried to keep herself busy, telling herself that whatever the camera revealed, she could handle it. After all, she was his mother, and no matter what she found, she would protect him. When the school bell finally rang, Marian's heart raced. She hadn't been able to get a good sense of what had happened during the day. There was no telling what she might see. She waited for Caleb to come home, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to confront whatever truths the camera might hold. When Caleb finally wheeled himself through the door, he didn't look any different. No new signs of distress, no obvious change in his demeanor. Marian offered him a smile, masking her anxiety. "How was school today, Caleb?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "It was fine," Caleb replied, his tone distant. "Same as always." Marian nodded and led him to his room, where he placed his backpack on the bed. As she opened the zipper and retrieved the small camera, her hand shook. She was about to uncover something that could change everything. The footage began to play, and Marian's eyes scanned the screen. She expected to see the usual footage of a quiet, uneventful school day, perhaps Caleb sitting alone in class or during lunch. But what she saw instead took her completely by surprise. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't bullying. It wasn't exclusion. What Marian saw was something far more surprising, something that left her speechless and in tears. The quiet school day. The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, and Caleb wheeled himself into the classroom, his gaze briefly meeting the eyes of a few classmates who were already seated. His heart raced, but only slightly. He had learned to bury his nerves. As he passed by, the other children glanced at him for a fraction of a second before turning back to their conversations or notes. The brief glances stung, like needles. They didn't notice him. They never did. Mrs. Thompson, a well-meaning teacher with a gentle smile, was busy organizing papers on her desk as the students filed in. She smiled at Caleb when he entered the room, but the greeting was perfunctory, almost like a formality she followed each morning. There was kindness in her eyes, but it never quite reached Caleb. Perhaps it was because she didn't understand. Perhaps it was because she couldn't see the quiet desperation in his eyes. "Good morning, Caleb," Mrs. Thompson said, offering him a quick nod as he wheeled himself to his desk in the back corner of the room. "Morning," Caleb mumbled, settling in, trying to ignore the slight tremor in his hands as they rested on his lap. He placed his books on the desk, one by one, carefully arranged to avoid drawing attention to the small imperfections in the covers. His gaze flicked over to the other students, already deep in their own conversations. The familiar ache in his chest tightened. He wanted to join in. He wanted to be a part of it all, to laugh and talk without feeling so invisible. But the thought of speaking up, of trying to break into their world, felt too difficult, too impossible. The lesson began, and as Mrs. Thompson spoke, Caleb's mind drifted. He didn't want to pay attention to the lesson. He just wanted to escape the feeling that was steadily suffocating him. He watched the others, so effortlessly engaged with the lesson. Some of them laughed at something the teacher said, while others whispered quietly to each other, sharing private jokes. Caleb was never part of those moments. He sat silently, scribbling notes that he wouldn't remember later, pretending to understand concepts that felt distant and far removed from his own reality. It wasn't just the classroom where Caleb felt like an outsider. It was everywhere. As lunch approached, a familiar sense of anxiety began to settle in. The lunch bell rang, and the students rushed out of the classroom. Caleb followed slowly, careful not to bump into anyone with his wheelchair. The cafeteria was loud, filled with the chaos of students in cliques, laughing and exchanging stories, with the noise echoing off the walls. Caleb felt a familiar sense of dread wash over him. He wheeled himself to a corner of the cafeteria, looking for a spot that was as far from the laughter as possible. He noticed a table with a few open spots, but the kids who were sitting there were deep in conversation, their backs turned. Caleb hesitated, then decided to keep moving. He couldn't bring himself to ask to join. It had never worked before. He didn't want to be the one who disrupted their conversations with his awkward attempts at belonging. The embarrassment felt too much to bear. Finally, he found a small table near the window and parked his wheelchair next to it. He unpacked his lunch slowly, making sure he wasn't drawing too much attention to himself. The students at the table were laughing, talking about their favorite TV shows, comparing notes on a school project. No one looked at Caleb. No one acknowledged his presence. He ate in silence, watching the world move around him. The laughter felt like a foreign language, something he could never fully understand. He had once been the boy who would have joined in the conversation, the one who would have made everyone laugh, who would have offered a clever joke or story to share. But those days were gone. Now he was just a boy in a wheelchair, an invisible shadow at the edge of their world. At the next table, two girls glanced at him briefly, then exchanged a quick look. One of them laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that would have invited him in. It was the kind of laugh that left him feeling small and insignificant. Caleb lowered his head, trying to pretend he hadn't heard, trying to ignore the sting of rejection. His hands gripped the edges of his lunch tray, his knuckles white. The minutes ticked by slowly as Caleb finished his lunch. He didn't rush. He never did. There was no reason to. The rest of the students would soon finish and return to class, and he could retreat back to his desk, back to the solitude where he didn't have to face the stares, the awkwardness, the discomfort. But before he could leave, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, Caleb, you want to play soccer at recess?" Caleb blinked, his heart skipping a beat. The voice came from Jake, a boy he had seen in class, but never really talked to. Jake wasn't one of the popular kids, but he was always friendly and seemed to want to include everyone. Caleb stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You want me to play?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking slightly. Jake smiled. "Yeah, we could use an extra person. You don't have to run, just kick the ball around. It'll be fun." For a moment, Caleb felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things were about to change. Maybe this could be the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything shifted, when he would finally feel included. But then his doubt crept in, as it always did. What if he wasn't welcome? What if they were just being polite? What if this invitation wasn't genuine? He hesitated, the weight of his own insecurities pressing down on him. But something inside him told him to try, to take the risk. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll try. Outside, the playground was bustling with activity. Students ran in every direction, their laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. Caleb wheeled himself toward the soccer field, his heart pounding in his chest. The grass felt cold beneath his feet, and the ball was moving quickly as the other kids kicked it back and forth. Caleb sat on the sidelines at first, unsure where to position himself, unsure if he would even be accepted. But Jake waved him over, gesturing toward a spot near the goal. "Come on, Caleb. We need you to be the goalie," Jake called out. Caleb's heart leaped in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where he could finally feel like part of something. He wheeled himself into position and readied himself, trying to push aside the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt like he was part of something. As the game went on, he laughed when he stopped a shot, cheered when his teammates scored, and joked around with the others. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the same as when he could run and play like the other kids. But for the first time, he felt like he belonged. For the first time, he wasn't the boy on the outside looking in. As the bell rang to signal the end of recess, Caleb wheeled himself back to the classroom, his heart a little lighter than before. He had been included. He had been seen. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like the world wasn't so far out of reach. Back at home that evening, Marian watched Caleb as he wheeled himself into the living room, a genuine smile on his face. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. There was something different about him tonight. "How was school today?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly with anticipation. "It was good," Caleb said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "I played soccer at recess, and they let me be goalie." Marian's heart swelled with relief. Her fears about bullying and isolation had been confirmed, but hearing Caleb's words was a balm to her soul. He had been included today. For once, he wasn't alone. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb smiled, a shy but genuine smile. "Yeah, Mom, it was fun. Maybe I'll play again tomorrow." Marian nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so glad, sweetheart. I'm so glad." That night, as Marian tucked Caleb into bed, she promised herself that she would do everything in her power to make sure this wasn't just a one-time thing. She would make sure her son would never feel invisible again. No matter what it took, she would fight for him, just like she always had. The unseen battles. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Caleb. What had started as a simple invitation to join a soccer game turned into a turning point. For the first time in months, Caleb began to feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. There was a sense of purpose in his step, a spark of hope in his eyes that Marian hadn't seen in such a long time. It wasn't much, but it was something worth holding on to. Yet, despite the newfound sense of belonging, there was a part of Caleb that couldn't fully shake off the fear that lingered in the back of his mind. Each time he wheeled himself to school, there was still that quiet voice in his head whispering that he didn't truly belong, that he would always be the outsider, the one who was different. The same doubts crept in when he was alone in the hallway or in the cafeteria, watching as other kids made jokes, exchanged glances, and shared moments that he couldn't quite break into. Still, the small victories kept him going. Every time he joined in the soccer game at recess, every time one of the other kids waved at him or laughed with him, the feeling of exclusion lessened just a little bit. He was making progress, and that was something. But even as the moments of inclusion grew, so did his internal battle. It was a Wednesday morning when Marian first began to notice the subtle change in Caleb's mood. He was quieter than usual, his eyes darting nervously around the house as if he were waiting for something. Marian couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it was clear something was off. He wasn't his usual self. "Caleb, honey, is everything all right?" Marian asked, glancing up from the stove as she prepared breakfast. Caleb glanced at her quickly but didn't meet her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine, Mom. Just tired, I guess." Marian wasn't convinced. She could see it in the way he fidgeted with his shirt sleeves, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. It wasn't like Caleb to be so withdrawn, especially after the good experiences he'd been having at school. "You're sure?" Marian pressed, her tone gentle but insistent. "Yeah, really," Caleb said, though his voice was laced with a hint of uncertainty. He grabbed his backpack from the chair and slung it over his shoulder. "I'll be fine, Mom." The answer didn't sit right with Marian. She watched as he wheeled himself to the door, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. The same tightness in his shoulders, the same distant look in his eyes. It was a sign that something was still bothering him. That afternoon, Marian decided to check the camera footage again. She had hesitated to do so before. After all, Caleb had seemed to be doing better. But her maternal instincts were buzzing. Something was amiss, and she needed to know what. The camera's small screen flickered to life, and Marian's breath caught in her throat. She could see Caleb in his classroom again, seated in his usual spot, his eyes focused on the desk in front of him. Mrs. Thompson was at the front of the room, speaking with the students, but there was a strange tension in the air. Caleb wasn't fully engaged like he had been the past few days. His gaze kept drifting to the clock, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his desk. It didn't take long before Marian's suspicions were confirmed. Caleb's classmates were laughing, as they often did, but this time, there was something different in their behavior. Two boys at the front of the room whispered to each other, throwing occasional glances toward Caleb. Marian's heart skipped a beat as she watched one of them make a gesture, an exaggerated eye roll, while the other boy chuckled. Caleb didn't notice, but Marian did. Her stomach churned. The whispers continued throughout the lesson. Occasionally, Marian could make out bits of conversation, their words so quiet that they barely reached Caleb's ears. They didn't say anything outright cruel, but the tone of their voices and the way they avoided looking at him said enough. Caleb had become the subject of a subtle, silent cruelty. The worst kind, because it wasn't overt. It wasn't something he could confront. It was all done behind his back, in quiet glances and whispers. It was heart-wrenching to watch. Marian's chest tightened as she watched Caleb, so unaware of the quiet jabs being thrown his way. He was still trying to fit in, still doing his best to be part of something he didn't fully understand. And yet, the undercurrent of rejection was building again. The footage moved to the lunchroom, and Marian's fear deepened. Caleb had found a spot at a table with a few other students, but they were all sitting with their backs to him. They didn't engage in conversation. They barely acknowledged he was there, save for the occasional glance when they passed food to one another. Marian watched, her heart breaking as Caleb silently ate his lunch, staring off into the distance, as though he had long accepted the fact that he was invisible to them. He wasn't crying. He rarely cried anymore. But the isolation was clear. He had grown so used to it, so accustomed to being overlooked, that it had become his new normal. Then something caught Marian's eye. A boy sitting at the table across from Caleb, who had previously seemed indifferent, reached over and nudged one of his friends, glancing in Caleb's direction. Marian could barely hear the whisper, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. "He doesn't even have anyone to sit with." Pathetic. The words were small, barely audible, but they hit Marian like a punch to the gut. Caleb hadn't heard them, but she had. And she felt them like a dagger through her heart. Her hand trembled as she stopped the footage. The reality of what her son was enduring was far worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just bullying. It wasn't just exclusion. It was a slow, almost invisible form of social death. It was the kind of torment that gnawed away at his self-esteem day after day, making him question his worth. Her breath caught in her throat, and Marian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She needed to do something. She had always known that Caleb had struggled, but this was worse than she had feared. That evening, Marian waited for Caleb to return home. Her mind was racing with plans, ideas, and fears of what might be happening next. But when Caleb walked through the door, something unexpected happened. He looked lighter, a little more at ease. There was a small, tentative smile on his face, a glimmer of something that hadn't been there earlier in the day. Marian could feel the tension in her chest ease as she saw the look in his eyes. "Hey, honey," Marian said softly, a little hesitant, but hoping for an explanation. Caleb didn't immediately answer. Instead, he wheeled himself to the couch and sank into the cushions with a deep sigh, letting his backpack fall to the floor beside him. He looked over at Marian, his expression thoughtful. "I had a good day," he said quietly. Marian's heart clenched. "Good? How? What happened?" Caleb shrugged, but the smile remained. "Well, Jake invited me to play soccer again. And today, it was like they actually wanted me to be there. It was fun." Marian's heart surged with relief, but the sadness remained in her chest. She couldn't ignore what she had seen on the footage. The torment, the isolation, the quiet cruelty. It was still there, waiting to take hold of him again. "Caleb," Marian began gently, "how are you really doing at school? You know you can talk to me, right?" Caleb looked at her, his expression uncertain. I don't know, Mom. Sometimes it's better, but other times I still feel alone. I don't know how to make them see me." Marian took a deep breath, her heart breaking for him. She knew now that it wasn't just about fitting in. It was about feeling seen, heard, and valued. But as much as she wanted to protect him, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. "I promise you, Caleb," Marian said softly, "I will do everything I can to make sure you're never invisible again." Caleb smiled faintly. It wasn't the big carefree grin he used to wear, but it was something. It was a start, and Marian would fight for him, no matter what it took. In the days that followed, Marian began to put her plan into motion. She knew she couldn't change everything overnight, but she wasn't going to wait any longer. The quiet cruelty her son faced at school couldn't go on. She would be his advocate. She would make sure that this time, Caleb would be seen, understood, and most importantly, respected. She had a long road ahead of her, but Marian knew one thing for sure. She would not let her son fight this battle alone. A mother's resolve. The next few days passed in a blur for Marian. She could barely sleep, her mind racing with the realization that her son was silently enduring more than she could have ever imagined. The footage she had witnessed replayed in her mind over and over. Those subtle glances, the whispered comments, the cruelty disguised as indifference. It ate away at her, but it also fueled her determination to act. She couldn't sit by any longer, letting Caleb face this fight alone. She would be his voice, his shield. That evening, as Marian was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email from the school, a notification about a parent-teacher meeting scheduled for the following week. Marian stared at it for a moment, her thoughts colliding. She had never been one to jump to conclusions, but the words parent-teacher meeting now felt like the perfect opportunity to address the unspoken issues that plagued her son's daily life. The thought of confronting the teachers, the principal, and the school staff about Caleb's struggles made her stomach churn, but she knew it was time. Her decision was clear. She would not wait for things to get worse. The night before the meeting, Marian lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with 100 different questions. How should she approach the conversation? Should she be direct, or would a more subtle approach work better? She wanted to make sure the school understood the depth of Caleb's struggles without coming off as an overprotective mother. The delicate balance between advocating for her son and fostering understanding was a challenge. But the answer was simple. She had to be honest. For Caleb's sake, she had to lay it all out in the open. At the meeting, Marian entered the small, sterile conference room, feeling her nerves rise. Caleb had stayed home with a friend, not wanting to accompany her to what he called a boring meeting. Marian couldn't blame him. He had enough to deal with at school without having to sit through what might very well feel like another interrogation. But Marian knew this meeting was different. This was her chance to make sure his voice was heard, even if he wasn't there to speak for himself. The room was already filled with teachers, the principal, and the counselor, professionals who, at least on the surface, appeared well-meaning. Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who Caleb had spoken of so often, smiled at Marian as she entered the room. The kind smile didn't reach her eyes, but Marian wasn't fooled. There was something beneath that smile, something that left her unsettled. "Good evening, Marian. I'm glad you could join us," the principal, Mr. Davidson, said warmly as she sat down. "We've been looking forward to discussing Caleb's progress with you." Marian nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had seen enough of the way Caleb was treated at school to know that any discussion about progress would be incomplete without the full story. She cleared her throat, steeling herself. "I'm glad to be here," Marian began, keeping her tone measured. "But before we get into the specifics of Caleb's academic progress, there's something I need to address. I'm concerned, very concerned, about the social environment at school." The room grew quiet as Marian's words hung in the air. Mr. Davidson raised an eyebrow, his pleasant demeanor shifting slightly. Mrs. Thompson glanced down at the table, and the school counselor, Mrs. Holloway, leaned forward, her pen poised above her notepad. "I've been watching my son, and I've been paying close attention to the signs that something isn't right," Marian continued, her voice steady but firm. "I know Caleb is different. I know he faces challenges that other kids don't, and I know it's not always easy for him. But what I've seen over the past few weeks is deeply troubling. Caleb is being isolated at school. He's being ignored, talked about behind his back, and made to feel as though he doesn't belong." The silence in the room grew heavier. Marian's heart pounded in her chest, but she pressed on. She needed them to understand. She needed them to see what she saw when she looked at her son. "Caleb has always been a sensitive, bright child," Marian said, her voice quivering slightly with emotion. "But lately, I've noticed a change in him. He's quieter, withdrawn. He's stopped talking about his day like he used to. He's stopped asking to join in activities, stopped trying to make friends. And when he does, it's like he's invisible." The counselor shifted in her seat, her gaze thoughtful. "What kind of incidents have you observed?" she asked, her voice soft. Marian took a deep breath. "I've seen the way the other kids treat him. It's not overt bullying, not in the way we traditionally think of it. But it's exclusion, it's the whispers, the glances, the kind of behavior that makes Caleb feel worthless. He doesn't say much about it, but I can see the impact it's having on him. And that's why I'm here, because this is a problem, and it needs to be addressed." Mrs. Thompson, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, her voice quiet but defensive. "I've noticed Caleb's quiet nature, but I've always tried to include him in class activities. He seems to prefer keeping to himself, and I've never observed anything that would indicate he's being treated unfairly by his peers." Marian clenched her jaw, her patience beginning to wear thin. She had hoped for more awareness from the teacher. Mrs. Thompson was kind, but her lack of recognition of the problem felt dismissive. "I understand, Mrs. Thompson, but that's part of the issue," Marian replied, her voice steady but assertive. "Caleb doesn't always speak up when something is wrong. He internalizes it. I've seen him get so quiet and withdrawn that it's like he's given up trying. I don't believe this is something that will resolve itself with time. He needs support now." The room fell silent again, the weight of Marian's words sinking in. Mr. Davidson shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He cleared his throat, glancing at Mrs. Thompson before addressing Marian. "We take any concerns about student well-being seriously, Marian," Mr. Davidson said slowly. "But we do encourage students to speak up, We have an open-door policy here, and we encourage children to approach us if they feel like something is wrong." Marian leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Caleb has spoken up. He's tried, but he's not always heard, and I think that's part of the problem. There's a culture of indifference among some of the students, and while I don't want to assume anything about the staff, I'm concerned that this issue hasn't been addressed as fully as it should have been." She could feel the tension in the room now, the discomfort of being confronted with something they hadn't anticipated. But Marian didn't let up. She would not back down for Caleb. She was not going to leave the room until the issue was acknowledged and a real plan of action was put in place. "I'm here today because I want solutions," Marian continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to know how the school plans to address this issue, not just for Caleb, but for any child who feels like they don't belong. I'm not going to let this slide. I will fight for my son, and I expect the school to do the same." Mrs. Holloway, the counselor, nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concerns, Marian. I believe we can work together to create a plan that will support Caleb and help him integrate more smoothly into the social fabric of the school. It's going to take time, but I think we can start by setting up some small group activities to encourage positive interactions and help Caleb develop connections with other students." Mr. Davidson's tone softened. "We can also provide more classroom support, Marian. I'd like to suggest some additional measures to ensure Caleb feels seen and heard in class. Perhaps we could assign a peer buddy, someone who will keep an eye out for Caleb and help him feel included." Marian felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The school was finally listening. They were beginning to acknowledge the problem and take steps to fix it. "I appreciate that," Marian said, her voice steady but weary. "But I want this to be an ongoing conversation. I don't want to just check a box and move on. We need to make sure that this continues to be a priority. Caleb's well-being isn't something we can afford to neglect." Mr. Davidson nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Marian. We'll work together to make sure Caleb is fully supported." As Marian left the meeting that evening, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was no longer fighting this battle alone. For the first time, the school had heard her, and for the first time, Caleb had a chance to be truly seen. A glimmer of change. The days following the parent-teacher meeting felt like a whirlwind for Marian. The momentum that had built during the meeting pushed her forward, but it wasn't without its challenges. Every step toward change felt like it had to be earned, and Marian knew that this would be a long process. Caleb had come home the day after the meeting, looking a little brighter, but still guarded. She wasn't sure if he truly believed that anything would change, or if he was just giving her the space to hope. Marian had always been a practical woman. She didn't allow herself to get lost in unrealistic expectations. But this was different. For Caleb's sake, she had to believe. She had to push forward, because that was what any mother would do for her child. The first concrete sign of change came a week later, when Caleb came home from school with a surprising smile on his face. It was a small thing, but it was everything to Marian. He didn't seem as burdened as he had before. He wasn't avoiding eye contact or speaking in short, terse sentences. There was a lightness in his voice, and though it wasn't exactly the joy-filled energy, it was enough to make Marian feel a renewed sense of hope. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Marian asked, trying to keep her tone casual, though her heart pounded in anticipation. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "It was better. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was better. Some of the kids from class asked me to play with them at recess today. It was just normal, you know." Marian could hear the tentative optimism in his words, but she knew better than to get her hopes up too high. This was just one small moment of progress. She could see how his guard remained up, how the shadows of his past experiences lingered in his eyes, but she also saw something else, a flicker of belief, something she hadn't seen in him for a long time. "That's great, Caleb. I'm proud of you for giving it a try," Marian said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "And if you ever need to talk, or if something's bothering you, I'm here, okay?" Caleb nodded, but the faint smile on his face quickly faded. "I don't know, Mom. It's just, sometimes I still feel like I don't belong. Like I'm different, and no one really gets it." Marian's heart sank at his words, but she didn't push him. She could see how deeply he was still carrying that sense of isolation. It was something she couldn't solve with a simple conversation, but she promised herself that she would never stop trying to make things better for him. The changes that Marian had fought so hard for were beginning to take root, albeit slowly. Mrs. Thompson had assigned Caleb a peer buddy, a student named Lucas who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. Lucas was the kind of kid who could effortlessly make friends, someone who had that natural charisma that made him well-liked by his peers. Caleb was still hesitant, but Lucas was patient, speaking to him gently during lunch and even inviting him to join group projects. One afternoon, Marian had the chance to witness this budding friendship firsthand. She was waiting outside the school to pick up Caleb when she noticed him and Lucas walking side by side. They were talking, really talking, about the upcoming science project, their conversation lighthearted but genuine. Marian stood there for a moment, watching them, her heart swelling with a bittersweet mixture of relief and pride. As Caleb reached the car, his expression was one of quiet contentment. Lucas said we should team up for the project. He said I'm good with ideas, Caleb said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. He's really nice. He actually listens when I talk. Marian's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the words, but the tone in Caleb's voice that made her realize how deeply this meant to him. For the first time in months, he was starting to trust again. He was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have a place in this world that wasn't defined by his differences. "That sounds like a good idea," Marian said, her voice tight with emotion. "I'm glad you're working together." As the weeks went on, Marian continued to monitor Caleb's progress, watching for any signs that the bullying or exclusion still existed. The footage from the camera had become a tool she no longer needed as much. She was seeing firsthand that things were improving, even if the road ahead wasn't smooth. Caleb was still struggling with his confidence, but there was a sense of cautious optimism in his voice when he spoke about his days at school. One day, as Marian sat at the kitchen table working on some paperwork, she was interrupted by the sound of Caleb's wheelchair rolling down the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, his face alight with something she hadn't seen in a while: pride. "Mom, guess what?" Caleb said, his voice filled with excitement. "What happened?" Marian asked, looking up at him, her heart leaping with anticipation. "The science project. I got an A. Lucas and I worked together, and the teacher said it was one of the best presentations in the class." Caleb beamed, his eyes shining with pride. "It feels really good to be proud of something I did." Marian could hardly contain her joy. She jumped up from her seat and wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. "That's amazing, Caleb. I'm so proud of you. I knew you could do it." As they pulled apart, Caleb looked up at her with a mix of awe and relief. I didn't think I could do it at first, but Lucas helped me a lot. He actually made me feel like I was part of the team." It was a moment of true triumph for Caleb, proof that he was capable of achieving great things despite the struggles he faced. And more importantly, it was a validation that he was no longer isolated. He had found someone who saw him for who he truly was, not as the different kid in a wheelchair, but as a person with his own talents, thoughts, and potential. But Marian wasn't naive enough to believe that all the obstacles were behind them. While Caleb had found support in Lucas and made progress in his social interactions, there was still a lingering undercurrent of hesitation. Caleb had taken the first steps toward building relationships, but old habits and fears would take time to overcome. Marian continued to keep a close eye on him, always watching for signs of struggle, always making sure that he knew he had a mother who would fight for him no matter what. The school's support was growing stronger, And Caleb's newfound confidence was like a fragile blossom, but Marian knew it needed to be nurtured and protected. One afternoon, Marian and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the sun begin to set. The air was cooler, the evening breeze rustling through the trees. Marian took a deep breath, feeling a rare moment of peace as she glanced at Caleb. "You know, Caleb," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, "I think you're really starting to find your place. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm so proud of how far you've come, and I believe in you. Every single day." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, his gaze focused on the horizon. Marian waited, knowing that this would be one of those moments when Caleb would speak his truth. And when he did, it was softer than she expected, a vulnerable truth that he hadn't fully admitted to himself until now. "I know, Mom," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm starting to believe that I can actually belong somewhere. Maybe even at school. I don't know if everyone will ever get it, but I think I can make it through. I think I can." Marian's heart swelled with emotion as she placed her hand gently on his. For the first time, Caleb wasn't just talking about surviving. He was talking about living. And in that moment, Marian knew that the future wasn't as uncertain as it once seemed. Her son had started to believe in himself again, and that was more than enough. The path forward would still be filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Marian felt a sense of hope that had been absent from her life for too long. They were both learning, together, how to find strength and vulnerability and power in their voices. And they would continue to walk that path, one step at a time. A new beginning. The months that followed were marked by quiet but steady progress. Caleb's journey toward acceptance and confidence didn't happen overnight, but Marian had learned to celebrate the small victories, each one a testament to her son's resilience and courage. In the classroom, things were improving. Caleb's bond with Lucas deepened, and their collaboration on projects became a source of pride for both boys. Where Caleb had once hesitated, unsure of his place, he now contributed ideas with a quiet confidence, his voice no longer a whisper but a part of the classroom conversations. It wasn't just the projects that were changing, but Caleb himself. He was beginning to believe in his own value. Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who had once seemed distant, had started to take a more active role in supporting Caleb. She made sure to involve him in discussions, gently encouraging him when he was quiet, and offering him opportunities to express his thoughts. Her efforts were small but impactful, showing Caleb that his voice mattered. And yet, despite the improvements, Marian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done. She saw the way Caleb still occasionally withdrew when the noise of the world became too much, how he still struggled to trust that people wouldn't judge him for his differences. It was like a wound that had started to heal, but the scar remained. Marian knew that healing wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, difficult days when Caleb felt like giving up, but she also knew that every day was a new chance, a chance to show her son that he was loved, valued, and worthy of all the good things that life could offer. One afternoon, as Marian sat in her kitchen sipping her coffee, she heard the sound of Caleb's wheelchair rolling into the room. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face unusually serious. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Caleb said, his voice soft but firm. Marian put down her cup, her heart immediately picking up speed. She learned to listen to the tone of Caleb's voice, the way he chose his words carefully, as if weighing every syllable. "What's going on, sweetheart? Is everything okay?" Caleb hesitated, then wheeled himself over to the table, his eyes focused on the surface, as if gathering his thoughts. Marian waited patiently, knowing this was important. "I've been thinking about what you said. The part about being proud of me," Caleb began slowly, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his wheelchair. "And I know you've always been proud of me, even when I didn't believe it. But I think I'm starting to believe it too. I've been different. And I used to think that was a bad thing. But I'm starting to see it differently." Marian's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was speechless, unsure of where this conversation was going. But the vulnerability in Caleb's voice held her there, rooted in the present moment. She reached for his hand across the table, her grip gentle but firm, as if she could ground him in this newfound realization. "You are different, Caleb," Marian said softly, "but that's what makes you special. You don't need to change who you are. You just need to find people who see you for who you truly are. And you're finding that, aren't you?" Caleb nodded slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "Yeah, I think I am. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm not alone anymore. Lucas, the teacher, even the other kids, they've been different lately. I don't feel invisible as much. I don't feel like I have to hide who I am." Marian felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Caleb, his face lighting up with the kind of hope that had been buried beneath layers of fear for so long. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always been proud of you." As if to punctuate the moment, Caleb smiled. It wasn't just a faint smile. It was one of true happiness, a smile that reflected how far he had come. In that moment, Marian realized that her son was no longer the boy who hid behind his wheelchair, afraid of the world. He had become someone who was beginning to stand tall, not just physically, but emotionally. The school year was drawing to a close, and Marian had noticed a marked change in Caleb's demeanor. The boy who had once dreaded the idea of school now spoke about it with a sense of purpose, a new energy. He was no longer just surviving the day. He was living it, embracing it, and finding joy in the small moments. One day after school, Marian picked Caleb up from the usual spot, but there was something different about him. He was talking animatedly with Lucas, laughing at something the other boy had said. When they saw Marian, they both stopped, and Lucas waved. "Hey, Mrs. Harper." Lucas called out, his voice cheerful. "Caleb's finally agreed to join us for the end-of-year talent show. He's going to help with the science demonstration part. We were thinking of doing something with chemical reactions." Marian's heart swelled with pride as she looked at Caleb. He was smiling widely, his eyes filled with excitement. This was Caleb, the boy who had once been terrified of being the center of attention, now standing on the precipice of a new adventure. He wasn't just participating. He was an active part of something that required teamwork, trust, and courage. "That sounds like an amazing idea," Marian exclaimed, her eyes welling with unused tears. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb. I know you're going to do great." Caleb shrugged but couldn't hide the happiness radiating from him. "I don't know if I'm ready for the stage, but I'm ready to help. Lucas says we'll be fine." As Marian drove them home that evening, her mind wandered to the days before the meeting with the school. The months of uncertainty, the heartbreak of watching her son suffer in silence. But now, as she looked at Caleb beside her, she realized that those struggles had led them to this point, the beginning of something new. Caleb had come a long way, but more importantly, he had learned to believe in himself. And Marian had learned that while it was her job to fight for her son, it was also her job to step back and let him fight for himself when he was ready. She had to trust that he was stronger than she had ever realized. As the talent show approached, Marian couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet pride. This wasn't just about Caleb overcoming his fears. It was about him finding his place in the world, learning that he could be a part of something bigger than himself. And as she watched him on the day of the event, standing with his peers, his face lit up with joy as he presented the science demonstration, Marian realized that this was more than just a school event. It was a symbol of how far they had come. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward, a way to heal, to grow, and to find one's place in the world. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the year, Marian sat back in her seat, her heart full. Caleb had begun to believe in his worth, and Marian had found a deeper, more profound sense of trust in him. They were no longer defined by Caleb's struggles. They were defined by his courage, his strength, and his journey toward self-acceptance. And as the sun set on the school year, Marian knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, opportunity, and the unshakable bond between mother and son.